Playing at Business with Steve Reese, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Playing at Business podcast. I'm your host Steve Reese, and today we're looking at the future of toy manufacturing. Historically, I guess at least in my time in toys, I'm aware of us either having the choice of what we'd call nearshoring, or manufacturing locally, or manufacturing in China. In fact, China's been the dominant force in most of the time I've been in toys. But things are changing as China's economy evolves and matures, and toy companies can't really afford to bury their heads in the sand, because there may become a time when China's not quite the solution that it has been for the toy industry. So, I guess by way of introduction to this podcast, going back in time, the major Western economies, the North American countries, Western European companies had very significant manufacturing bases at home. In fact, in the toy industry, originally back in the day, most toys were made in the home market. I guess, even today, we see some kind of heritage and history from this. But over time, most of this local or kind of nearshored manufacturing has generally migrated eastwards. So I guess over my lifetime, from the 1970s onwards, we've moved manufacturing kind of around the Far East, really, from Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and ultimately China. So I guess the question is why? Why did we do this? When we come to look at how manufacturing is changing, why did we end up with China as the ultimate place to go? Well, I guess the simple answer is probably these three words: lower labour cost. As these Western economies migrated beyond manufacturing as the primary commercial base, wage expectations, lack of state support and subsidies kind of made overseas sourcing more economical in the end. I guess the other thing though is it's not just about lower labour costs, it's also about sheer scale and volume of people available to work in low-end manufacturing jobs. In the Far East obviously has billions of people who historically have been willing to take part in such jobs. So I guess the question is, what's changed? Why is this any different today? And I guess in order to kind of frame today and the future, I'm just going to take a step back first. So I remember sitting in meetings with engineers and manufacturing people, around about 20 years ago, and dealing with some of the imperfections of toy manufacturing in China, which was at that point less mature and obviously less experienced than it is today. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that China has always been perfect. It hasn't. There's obviously been a kind of a development of their capability, the knowledge, the capacity, standards, working culture, everything. There's obviously been some issues with intellectual property protection and counterfeiting in China, but overall it's been an amazingly reliable, cost-effective source of toys beyond anything the world has ever seen before. The challenge though now is that whilst China is still by far the most experienced and by far the most efficient source of toy production available, certainly en masse or on the scale that the global toy industry needs, it's probably not any longer the most cost-effective. There is a reality that China, as a centrally managed state, they're no longer wanting to manufacture these labour-intensive $2, $3 manufacturing cost items. They clearly, as a matter of policy, want to make cars, robots, rockets, just high tech in general. That's more where the economy is going. Originally these toy factories in China were staffed for the local workers, but over time, labour migrated from inland and built huge cities around what were relatively undeveloped areas around China's eastern coast. And we've kind of seemingly reached that tipping point where the urban development in those areas is no longer enticing enough for it, kind of no longer supporting the business model of workers going and living in the factory for a low wage, doing boring, tedious work away from their families. And so labour supply is increasingly a challenge, as there's, frankly, better paid work elsewhere. I think the other thing is, coupled with this, China's own One Belt initiative. It's likely to push some manufacturing further inland China and further away from the traditional toy heartlands in the east of China and southeast of China especially. So I guess if you're then looking at new manufacturing within China, why wouldn't you look at new manufacturing outside of China? You still have some of the same learning curves, so what's the difference? And I guess the reality is that cost inflation's been a major issue with China over the past decade, but we've hit a couple of seeming tipping points in the last year or two. Actually, as we speak in 2018, aside from the turbulence of Toys R Us and people really sharpening the belts, I guess, as a result, I've also seen more tipping points in terms of people saying, look, we've had this product, it's listed by some retailers, we can no longer manufacture it at a cost that makes it profitable enough for us to do it. How do we find alternatives outside of China? So I guess really that's where hopefully none of what we've said so far is news, but hopefully I can add some value in terms of looking at what the options and the alternatives are. So firstly, let me declare an interest, just to be transparent and open. So part of the day job, the business that my company runs is sourcing agency, primarily from India, but not entirely from India. But we've introduced dozens of factories to alternative manufacturing sources, as well as, frankly, some manufacturing sources amongst the traditional China heartland of toy manufacturing. But yeah, so let's look at the options. Just bear in mind my vested interest, I guess. So Vietnam is, in a way, it's been the lowest hanging fruit for existing manufacturing groups in China because it's closer to China. The culture is not so completely different. I mean, that's possibly an ignorant Western English thing to say. I don't know the two cultures so intimately, but the reality is it's certain that Chinese manufacturing groups have seen Vietnam as the lower hanging fruit. And so you'll actually find that much of the toy manufacturing of export standards in Vietnam is by the Vietnam factories of originally a Hong Kong or a China manufacturing group. The challenge is that Vietnam's cost difference is not so huge to make it hugely motivating. It is a bit cheaper, but not vastly. Also, there's limited population and existing innate kind of established industrial capacity. And also, in some ways, Vietnam's not all that easy a place to go and set up a factory. Although Vietnam will, in my opinion, be definitely a part of the long-term solution to this toy manufacturing conundrum. Back home again, if we move back to nearshoring, the reality is it's kind of expensive and it's not really where our economies in general are headed. And aside from, I guess, at the time of recording, I guess a bit of old school, keep manufacturing jobs at home, kind of in the USA, that's not really where the world as a whole has gone. And frankly, personally, I'd be surprised if that whole initiative outlasts the current administration, or should we say president of the United States of America. Mexico, Mexico is an option for North American companies. It's closer, labour is cheaper. There are some problems though. Obviously, there's a kind of should we say, trade friction with the Trump administration. And also, I guess the labour is cheaper, but it's not that much cheaper. And also, there's not really a latent manufacturing base that has toy manufacturing experience. So, funnily enough, at the time of recording, in between me writing the script for this recording and actually recording it, Mattel announced that they're closing some manufacturing in Mexico. So I guess, maybe it heralds that Mexico is not going to be a fundamental kind of substantive part of the solution. It will obviously be part of it, but it's not going to make up for the vast capacity in China that may or may not be lost to the toy industry. And I think from a European perspective, there are two possible areas or countries or regions that could offer options. So Turkey for some of Europe, certainly cheaper. Eastern Europe definitely has some options. There are some reasonably good toy factories in Eastern Europe with export level kind of certified factories. However, you're talking about limited capacity, you're talking about limited populations, and I guess over time the trend within the European Union will be to partly equalise out kind of income disparities. So whether that's really the long-term answer, I don't know, but certainly for European companies in the toy industry, it's definitely worth having a look at. Then I guess you've got other Asia, so Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, followed by India. So I'm going to come back to India in a second. But I guess Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, they don't have the same potential size of workforce. They don't have the same existing industrial capacity, and I guess there are other kind of local issues which would prevent them from becoming the major hubs of toy manufacturing, on the scale that China currently has. For certain, all of those places will play a part, but probably not the substantive part. Which brings me really to what my analysis suggests is the only long-term alternative. Now, there's a reason why I spent the last 4 or so years focusing on India as a toy manufacturing option, and that's because really I see it as being the only long-term alternative. Once China kind of at state level decides it's not really interested in these jobs, and they start to increase the environmental protections, it increases the price of packaging, increases basically just the general cost of getting toys out. They don't really even want those kind of jobs anymore, because it's not where the economy's headed. So there's only really one country in the world that is interested in that kind of manufacturing, that does have the scale of workforce, and that does have the kind of existing industrial capacity. So that's India. And the reality is that capacity is probably the major issue for toy businesses. Okay, in the end, everybody is more concerned about cost. But I can tell you now, if a toy company cannot find manufacturing capacity in those 3 or 4 months of peak manufacturing in the run up to the kind of the Q4 period when retail sell-through is peak, then you're not going to be able to sustain a business. So capacity is actually as big an issue as cost, actually. Available labour, the only country in the world with a similar population size to China is India. The difference is, though, it's still an urban population. The urban population is still looking to earn the kind of wage which is available in manufacturing. So whereas in China, the local population probably is no longer really looking for that kind of work, in India they still are. There's kind of if you go into any Indian city, I've been to Indian cities I'd never heard of before I went there that have 2 million people there. There's just a huge, vast array of people who are, in some cases, reasonably well educated and qualified, but open to doing these kind of jobs. The labour is significantly cheaper in India still versus China. So at the time of recording, it's probably about a third of the cost of China as a whole. It does vary from region to region in India. In some places you may find it's lower, even a quarter. And also, I guess, whilst there is cost inflation, it's starting from a much lower base. Also, I guess the other thing is, many people don't realise before they look at India seriously, the existing industrial capacity and industrial base is very significant in India. So India is a major automotive manufacturing hub, not just for the domestic market, but also export. So they make roughly 25 million cars a year in India, of which around half are exported. So it's quite likely that you're driving on roads surrounded by cars which have been made in India. Obviously, the automotive industry is much more advanced than the toy industry. If you can make a component for a machine which has 20,000 working parts and it doesn't break, you can probably make toys with 3 or 4 components. It's just the reality of that fact. The automotive industry supply chain has a huge amount of injection molded plastics. Modern day cars, most of the interior is actually made out of plastics. So you have in India $1 billion turnover supply chain companies who only make parts for car brands, and it's easy to transfer that domain knowledge to toys. The actual manufacturing part of that is not that much different. Obviously, the safety standards, the QA processes are different, and that's another thing which India has had to and will have to learn. But actually, the manufacturing process is not that different. Automotive engineering and lean production is way ahead of toys, like I said. So, it's not uncommon to find a factory which would have, say, 300 or 400 people on a production line in China having half that many in India. So you're not just saving on the cost per line worker, you're even saving on the amount of labour on the line itself. Just to put this in context, just in case you're thinking it's kind of low-end brands, brands like Mercedes, BMW, or Audi, JCB, all these people make in India with state-of-the-art plants. This is not the India of kind of the British Raj and whatever else. This is a highly developing, fastly developing manufacturing economy. Just to put this in context, I drove past a massive Mercedes-Benz plant on my first trip to India, and I kind of went, wow. I mean, knowing that company, knowing the standards, knowing how long those cars last. If you go into a taxi in Germany, they're often old Mercedes cars that have 200,000, 300,000 kilometers on the clock, and there's a reason why they're still running, because of the pure quality of the build. And some of these cars are now being made in India. So I guess the other thing I would say is, major retailers are already shipping out of India, partly because there's already a number of toy companies operating in India, especially the larger ones. So the Walmarts, the Targets, all these people, Toys R Us as was, I guess, in some countries, they're already taking product out of India for the toy aisle. The other thing I would say, which is actually quite a big one, is that because India is a democracy, and also because of the British heritage on the kind of law, the legal framework, the labour laws in India are far more protective of workers. So you don't really have the same ethical audit issues that you may sometimes have in China, where you have these people who've moved away from their families. They've actually got nothing else to do apart from work. They want to work because they want to help to support their families. So in China factories, sometimes the nature of the dorm culture actually kind of encourages and facilitates the infringements on kind of ethical audit and ethical working practices. You don't really have that to the same degree in Indian factories. For sure, you still need standards, you still need safety, but I've worked for more than a dozen export level toy factories in India, and I've not had a single audit fail or a single significant issue. Typically the factory labour is often female in India. It's often people post secondary education, maybe between the age of maybe 18, 19 and 22, 23. So you're not having, and there's an abundant supply of that labour, so you're not having the same pressure to maybe find people who are younger, or to make people work longer hours. Actually, in fact, in some areas of India, the factory legally has to transport the workers to and from the factory, and they legally have to have them out of the factory, and they are responsible for getting them back in their own homes by a certain time. So you don't tend to have those same ethical audit infringements, basically. So I guess in summary on India, really the reason why I spent the last 4 years travelling in India, working with Indian factories, is because in terms of capacity and cost savings, it's actually the only solution. Typically, cost saving wise, it varies on the type of product, it varies on how aggressive your sourcing approach is in your current manufacturing. Plastics typically between about 7 and 12% cheaper in India, plus probably 10 to 15%. So I've definitely seen significant cost savings, aside from all the other factors involved. So just to be open and transparent on India before we move on, it's not perfect by a long shot. They're still learning as an industry and as a sector, so things can take longer. You have to be ready for that. When people first moved to China for toy manufacturing, it was the same. People have said to me when I presented India to them as a manufacturing solution today, it's probably like China was 30, 40 years ago, and you still find some kind of experienced old heads who can tell you what it was like. Any area undergoing heavy growth can lead to risks, because obviously growth is not always easy to manage. So to match the supply capacity, workforce, kind of overhead to demand is very difficult when you have a huge amount of demand that comes in quickly. So I know one major factory that unfortunately went bust due to trying to cash flow exponential growth, and left some customers in the lurch, which is obviously very unfortunate. But I think overall India still has a lot to offer longer term, and there's obviously a sector-based learning curve. You can only kind of really mitigate that by, frankly, if you want to avoid that learning curve, by being second or third there. Let everybody else go through the learning curve, take advantage of the initial cost savings. Maybe they'll make a bit more profit short term, but it will come with a bit of pain. And that's really a philosophical point. Can you cope with a degree of uncertainty and, I guess, project-based stress as everything matures in India, or can you not? Would you still be better off to pay 10% more to be in China as long as you can still find capacity? I think the other thing in India is that the supply chain lacks some depth. So, right now, if you go to certain areas of China, whatever you want to do involving a toy, it's all been done before, everything. So it's easy, you'll find it within, an hour's drive of the factory. You don't necessarily have the same depth of supply chain in India, so Indian factories are still buying some things in from China, which can expand the supply chain length. But they're sort of learning, I guess, day by day, and their capability is definitely coming up. I think the other thing is cultural and communication differences. You will definitely notice culture and the method of communication and the manner of communication is different. I guess in the same way as Chinese toy manufacturing people had to get used to the way Western business people work, and vice versa. It's the same thing, really. So just to kind of give you a top line on Indian toy manufacturing today, there's some very good export level factories there with all the right orders that you would need in the toy industry. Major companies, as has been publicised, Hasbro being one of them, have been manufacturing in India for quite a few years now. 3 or 4 years of a fairly major push. Other major companies are manufacturing there also. At the moment, it's primarily injection molded plastic products and plush products. I would say that demand is high in India with expanding capacity, but there's a long way to go to have anywhere near even a fractional capacity of China. So whereas right now in China, I'm finding that factories are very, very keen to find new work. In India, you'll find they're much more picky because they can afford to be, because demand is outstripping supply. Also at this point in time, just to manage expectations of people out there, the export level factories are generally not set up and also not really interested in smaller businesses. If you're spending less than a few $1 million a year on manufacturing, if you're wanting to manufacture a couple of products for like 10 or 20,000 units, it's not ready for you yet. India's not really ready for you yet with the export level factories. Personally, in my case, in that circumstance at this moment in time, I would still stick with China, maybe investigate Vietnam. So I guess in summary, it's obviously clear, everyone can see that the toy manufacturing landscape has already changed hugely in the last decade, and that trend looks set to continue. My analysis would suggest that of the roughly $35 to $40 billion a year of toys that are manufactured in China, we'd expect to see half of that moving out of China in roughly the next decade. It's very likely that China will retain the higher end toy production, so products which can be highly automated, products which are technology driven, seem to fit where the Chinese economy and the Chinese state are headed and wanting to go. But those lower end, really kind of labour heavy production items, really we see them shifting away from China over the next decade. And obviously there's likely to be a number of countries which will benefit from this move. Logically though, India seems likely to be the major beneficiary. India today, it has some really impressive high-end toy factories, some that would actually take your breath away. But it is still in its infancy. So there are ups and downs, and it's like everything. Kind of the start of that obviously has the biggest learning curve. We're into the learning curve, but it's not just as easy perhaps right now as China. But it's definitely getting better, and the change is coming. So I'd say even if you're not currently seeing the need to move away from your long established suppliers in China, it might well be a good idea to have a plan B in your locker. Needless to say, to finish on a kind of a shameless plug, needless to say, we can help companies who are spending more than a couple of $1 million on manufacturing find these export level certified factories in India, Vietnam and other places. ICTI, ICTI certified factories, Disney Pharma, Walmart audited and all that kind of stuff. And that's really all on this topic for now. So if you want to find out more about us, our day job, please go to www.kidsbrandinsight.com. I've been Steve Reef. No, not lately. I've been Steve Reese, your host. This has been the Playing at Business podcast, and we will hopefully see you next time.
Playing at Business with Steve Reese, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.